In this episode, I'll be explaining how the aperture controls depth of field.
Adorama TV presents Exploring Photography with Mark Wallace.
Hi everybody, welcome to this episode of Exploring Photography right here on Adorama TV. It's brought to you by Adorama. It's the camera store that has everything for photographers. Make sure you check them out at adorama.com. Well, here on Exploring Photography, I've been talking about the exposure triangle. And we talked about the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO, what those three things do and how they're related in stops and things like that. I've been saying that the aperture controls depth of field, but what is that? Well, on this episode, we're going to explain exactly what depth of field is, and to do that, I've invited Lex to come and be our model. Here we are in beautiful Hyde Park, Sydney, Australia, in downtown Sydney, Australia. And we've been having a blast here. Well, to understand how the aperture affects depth of field, we first need to understand what depth of field is. Now, when we focus our camera, Lex just looked right at me here. When we focus our camera, I'm focusing from my camera to a specific point, and so it's a distance. So this is way too close, but let's pretend I'm focusing right here. So I'm focusing from here to here. That might be a foot, it might be 2 feet, it might be 6 feet, but we have to understand that we're focusing to a distance. Now, the other thing that we're doing is we're not just focusing to a distance, we're focusing to a depth. So how much of Lex's head do I want in focus and how much of the background? So to understand that a little bit better, Lex, I'll have you go back here about 6 feet away from me. So if I'm focusing at my focus point about 6 feet away from right here, I'm going to focus on Lex, but I'm also getting a bunch of stuff behind her in focus and in front of her in focus. And how much of that we get is called our depth of field. So shallow depth of field, not very much in focus except for our subject. Extreme field of sharpness, thank you Tamalaki for letting me steal that from you. That is when we have everything in focus. When we have an aperture value that is a high number, a small opening like f16 or f22, we have everything in focus. But when we have our aperture value a really small number like f2.8, that's a really large opening and not much is in focus. So let me show you exactly what I mean. Now we have a horrible setup right here. We're in Hyde Park in Sydney, Australia, which is a beautiful park. There's a lot of people around. And to illustrate this, I've set this up where we have a bunch of trees behind Lex's head. It's sort of, we intentionally set this up in a bad scenario to show you the benefits of shallow depth of field. So if I shoot at around f16, I'm going to have almost everything in focus. So Lex, let me make sure I focus right here on your eyes. Beautiful. All right, let me make sure my camera is turned on. Excellent. All right, so what we're going to do at f16 is I'm going to get a shot here, and we'll see clearly that we have big problems. We have Lex, and we have this tree growing out of the back of her head. Now I can move around just a little bit and try to make this a little bit better. But the problem is the background is it's all over the place. What I want to do is get shallow depth of field to clean up that background like portrait photographers love. So I'm going to go all the way down, and I'm changing my aperture value from 16 all the way down to 2.8. So I'm opening it up. So now I'm going to focus my camera on your eyes one more time. I'm going to make sure that it is perfectly in focus. Yes, there we go. All right, now let's take that exact same photo. Perfect. And you can see that those trees are falling out of focus. It's cleaning things up. Well, this lens goes all the way to 1.4. It's got a huge aperture opening. And so we'll do this one more time. And you can see that I can really cheat this. I got to make sure I'm in focus here before I shoot this picture. There we go. Now I'll take this last picture. I like that so much more. So let's come on up here and look at this. Now, one of the things that you have to note is when you're shooting with a really wide aperture like 2.8 or 1.4, you have to be really careful on your focusing. That's why I was being really specific on that, because just any camera movement can knock your focus out. And so you might have the subject's hair in focus, but the eyes out of focus, or their nose in focus and their eyes out of focus. It can be that shallow. But we can take a look here, and here's this very, very first picture that we took. And you can see that we've got stuff growing out of your head that's just no good. That was at f16. Then we went to, we recomposed, we shot, not so good. We went to 2.8, it looks so much better. And then all the way down to 1.2. Now that's the winning shot, where we've got the background that's totally falling out. And you can see the difference between f16 and f1.2. It is much, much nicer. Now, one of the disadvantages or advantages, however way you want to look at it, most lenses don't have a 1.4 aperture value. This is a fancy lens, and you're going to be stuck at 5.6 or 2.8 or something around that. So what can you do? Well, good news, it's just not only the aperture that determines depth of field, but the size of your lens, the focal length, and how close you are to your subject. So can you get that really nice out of focus bokeh background with a lens that doesn't have 2.8? Absolutely. You want to be shooting with a 200 or 300 millimeter lens, or maybe 150, 135, something like that. You don't want to shoot with a wide angle lens, because the wide angle lens is going to have everything in focus almost every single time. And to prove it to you, I'm going to show you two pictures that we took just a few minutes ago. One, this shot right here was shot with the 135 millimeter lens, and we did this at an aperture value of, I believe, about 5.6 or 8, around there. And you can see that we have a really nice shallow depth of field. Now this next shot, we shot the exact same thing, but we used a wide angle lens. Take a look at that. Now this is a 21 millimeter lens. Oh my gosh, everything is in focus from start to finish. Even when we go to the widest aperture value, you can see that we open our aperture wide open, but everything is still in focus. So the size of your lens really matters. And the other thing that matters is how close you are to your subject. So the closer you get, the shallower your depth of field is going to be, the more out of focus the background is going to be. And the farther away you get, the more you're going to have everything in focus. So if you want to get your really nice shallow depth of field, use the longest lens you can and get as close as you can with the widest aperture that you can possibly have, and you'll have a winning shot. Well, there you have it, the aperture, depth of field, and our exposure triangle when we're trying to figure out, do I start with the aperture or the shutter speed? Well, if you want depth of field, the aperture is a huge, huge contender, and now you know why. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Exploring Photography. Don't forget that the Adorama Learning Center has tons of information about depth of field and focusing and all the stuff that we talked about today. In fact, about 5 years ago, I did an episode on depth of field. In fact, I looked at it before making this episode, and it's sort of dated, but it's still there on the Adorama Learning Center. It's absolutely free, so check that out. And don't forget that you can subscribe to Adorama TV. It's also free, and you won't miss a single episode. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.
Do you want great looking prints at low cost? Be sure to visit our easy to use online printing service. Adorama Pix has professionals who treat your images with the utmost care that you can count on. For a quick turnaround on photos, cards, or albums, use AdoramaPix.com.